Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at UC San Diego. My name is Steve Clary. I am the chair of the curriculum committee and the host of this afternoon's lecture, coming to you all by Zoom from one of our own, Dr. Dimsdale, Dr. Joe Dimsdale, also professor emeritus and the Edward Dickinson Emeritus Professor of Psychiatry. Joel is one of our leaders. I'm not sure when he ever sleeps. He's written over 500 articles. He's spoken to Osher countless times. He is a graduate of Carleton College, and he got his medical degree at Stanford, and then worked at Mass General, and then at Harvard Medical School when UCSD was fortunate to nab him or recruit him, and I'm never quite sure what the story has been. Joel started to speak with us years ago about his first book, probably not his first, but the one of most recent notoriety before his current book on dark persuasion. This one was The Anatomy of Malice, the enigma of the Nazi war criminals, in which he, while at Harvard Medical School, as I recall the story, someone showed up with a suitcase full of notes by the psychiatrists from the Nuremberg trials of interviews, Rorschach tests, and everything, dealing with 4 of the Nazi war criminals. And of course, the debate was, were these psychopathic criminals, or were they people following orders from the Fuhrer? And Joel lectured on it. His book became widely known, and we're fortunate that he spoke to us. Again, the book is Anatomy of Malice. His most recent book, and part of which he's going to talk about today, is called Dark Persuasion. And Joel has spoken to us a couple of times about that. A history of brainwashing, of the North Koreans during the Korean conflict, Pavlovian social media. Today, he's going to talk about one of the phenomena that he's been studying for some time called the Stockholm syndrome, in which hostages start to take the side of the hostage taker rather than the police. And Joel's going to describe sort of what accounts for this behavior and how frequently it occurs and what are the disputes surrounding it. Joel, thank you so much for being with us, and I welcome my colleagues and Lily and Eric and any other friends of Joel's. Welcome to Osher.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be with you all today via Zoom. As Steve mentioned, in the last year or so, we've talked together about various flavors of coercive persuasion, or brainwashing, as it's popularly known. The thing about brainwashing is that it's thought to take time. But interestingly, a number of hostage situations have revealed that flash conversion can occur quickly in hostages, whereby they seemingly adapt the captor's perspective. So before I start my slides, let me just pose a couple questions for us to think through together. How are hostages supposed to behave when captured? If they're rescued, what should their feelings be towards their captor? Now, the assumption is that obviously rescued hostages would feel grateful to their rescuers and would look forward to their assailants' punishment. The trouble is that many instances reveal that hostages' feelings and behaviors can be radically different from our expectations. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is to go over with you 2 separate domains that pertain to this. I'll be drawing a lot on hostage interviews and diaries. And I'll also be resorting to data. After all, I'm a retired medical school professor, and we like to have data and we like to count on our fingers and toes and get a little beyond the case histories. But that combination of case histories and data is very powerful. So I'd like to pose a question for you, and let me start sharing my screen. Can you all see?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I'd like to pose a question. From your life experience, how often do you think the Stockholm Syndrome occurs, and who is likely to be vulnerable? That's a tough question. Keep it in mind. So at the moment, many of us have been restricted on travel because of COVID. And so I'm going to take you some places today with me where you do not want to go. I'll start off with the Stockholm bank robbery, and I'll turn to other hostage situations and discuss the empirical data about the frequency of the Stockholm Syndrome, what makes people vulnerable, the fights about how to interpret it, and finally conclude with a discussion of some of these explanations. This is a picture of the Kreditbanken Bank on Stockholm's Norrmalmstorg Square. All of these hostage situations that I will be discussing today, I'm going to emphasize the length of the hostage's captivity because it emphasizes how rapidly these changes can be elicited. In Stockholm, it took 6 days. On August 23rd, 1973, the intelligent and experienced robber John Erik Olsson entered the Kreditbanken Bank in Stockholm. He intended to seize hostages, get his friend Clark Olofsson released from prison, rob the bank, and escape. He fired a submachine gun into the ceiling of the bank and captured 4 bank employees, herded them into the bank vault, tethered them on leashes, and began to negotiate. There was a no man's land corridor in front of the bank vault where the toilets were and where the police and robbers could confer on terms. The police surrounded the bank and began negotiations. They released Olsson's buddy, Clark Olofsson, who joined Olsson and the hostages in the bank. Meanwhile, the police used surveillance microphones and cameras so they could eavesdrop on the abductors and their hostages. They also began drilling holes into the ceiling of the vault to pipe in tear gas if necessary. The grainy images from the surveillance camera capture the drama of the situation. Olsson thought the robbery would result in a successful quick negotiation. Instead, it turned out to be an exhausting 6-day standoff. While the experience was terrifying to the hostages, the robbers treated them with some consideration. One young woman, Kristen Einmark, commented that Olsson was very kind because he let her go to the bathroom off leash. When she went to the bathroom, she saw police hiding in the corridor. They asked her how many hostages were in the vault, and she showed them by holding up her fingers. She remembers thinking, I felt like a traitor in telling the police. I don't know why. During her captivity, hostage Birgitta Lundblad spied an armed policeman approaching and screamed out, "Don't shoot!" Warned of the intruder, Olsson shot and wounded the policeman. The robbers negotiated for a telephone and encouraged their hostages to make calls. Birgitta was unsuccessful in reaching her husband and began to cry when John Olsen touched her cheek and told her to try again. On another occasion, he consoled her by drawing her to his knees and holding her. As Birgitta reported, the robber told me that everything would be all right if only the police would go away. I agreed with him. Yes, I thought, it is the police who are keeping me from my children. Prime Minister Olof Palme himself entered the negotiations via telephone. Olsen, impatient with the delays, grabbed Elizabeth Oldgren by the throat and threatened to kill her immediately unless the government guaranteed their getaway. Then he hung up. Later, Elizabeth was chilled and shivering in the bank vault, but Olsen draped his coat around her. She later recounted that he presented an unlikely combination of brutality and tenderness. The government requested a visit to examine the hostages to verify their well-being, and the robbers agreed. The police were flabbergasted at what they found. The hostages greeted them with sullen hostility, and Jan, relaxed and easygoing, had his arms around the women as though they were friends. Hostage Kristin Einmark phoned the prime minister, and during the 45-minute conversation showed a surprising antagonism against her would-be rescuers. I have the transcript. Kristin, I'm very disappointed. I think you're sitting there playing checkers with our lives. I fully trust Clark and the robber. They have been very nice. But you know, Olaf, what I'm scared of is that the police will attack and cause us to die. Prime Minister, but the police will not do that. Kristin, I want you to let us go away with the robber. Give them the foreign currency and 2 guns and let us drive off. Dearest Olaf, sweetheart, it may sound stupid, but I trust them. I know they would let us go as long as the police don't chase us. Prime Minister, the police will not harm you. Can you believe that? Kirsten, you must forgive me, but in this situation, I do not believe it. Prime Minister, I think that's terribly unfair. Here are a great many policemen risking their lives who've not moved aggressively in all this time. The purpose, of course, is to protect you. Kristen, if the police come in here, he will shoot, and then they will shoot, and then nobody has a chance to survive. Jan Olsen reassured Kristen by holding her hands. Then he approached her, caressed her, and explained that he had not slept with a woman for almost 2 years. She allowed him to touch her breasts and hips, but refused to have intercourse. He turned away and, while lying next to her, masturbated on the carpet of the bank vault. So Jan did not torture, shoot, or rape the hostages. On the contrary, he was supportive of them, offered them food, stroked them comfortingly. The hostages began to fear the police more than the bank robbers. From the vault, they phoned their families, the press, the government, complaining about the police, even though it was the robbers who held them at gunpoint. Meanwhile, the robbers feared that the police would pump tear gas into the vault. They forced the hostages to stand, strung nooses around their necks, and warned the police that if gas was used, the hostages would collapse, hang, and die before the police could get to them. The tear gas came anyway. Miraculously, the robbers surrendered without further casualties, and to everyone's surprise, the hostages kissed them and shook hands in farewell. As they were led off to jail, one hostage called out, "Clark, I'll see you again." Even during their debriefing in the days following their liberation, the hostages regarded the police as the enemy and felt that they owed their lives to the robbers. But they themselves were puzzled by their responses, and they asked their doctors, "Why don't I hate them?" In the face of sudden, life-threatening captivity lasting for several days, it is striking that the hostages became unaccountably fond of their captors and distrustful of the people who were trying to rescue them. What was going on? I think four things were at play. Number one, the hostages were totally dependent upon their captors, who controlled every aspect of their lives: where they could go, what they could eat, when they could go to the bathroom. Number two, it was an extremely chaotic environment with some degree of sensory deprivation and sleep deprivation, and a constant fear of sudden death. Number three, the captors did not live up to their worst capabilities. While they wounded some policemen, they didn't kill them, nor did they shoot their captors or sadistically torment them. And finally, number four, as the hours stretched into days of captivity in close proximity, both captors and captives started seeing some humanity in each other. The hostages became convinced that they had more to fear from the police than from the hostage takers. On some level, as we'll see, they were right. Studies find that 4 times as many hostages die during a crossfire of a rescue attempt. They die, 4 times as many die in the hands of the security forces than are executed by terrorists. So the Stockholm Syndrome was not some unique Scandinavian liberal aberration. It has resurfaced in starkly different social contexts. Come travel with me to some more places you don't want to go. The red dots on the map denote locations we'll be discussing today. First stop, the Moluccan Islands in Indonesia. They're islands noted for their incredible beauty, diving lagoons, and ferocious tsunamis. They also have a frightful colonial history, most recently under Dutch subjugation. That history may explain why, in December 1975, a group from the South Moluccan Youth Movement seized a Dutch train and held hostages for 12 days, shooting some of the hostages while the rest remained in constant terror. I love this image of the peaceful Dutch countryside and the cows juxtaposed against the violence. One of the passengers on the train, Gerard Veders, was a prominent Dutch news editor who kept careful notes during his imprisonment. He wrote, "You had to fight a certain feeling of compassion for the Moluccans. I know this is not natural, but in some way they came over as human. They gave us blankets. But we also realized that they were killers. You try to suppress that in your consciousness. I also knew that they were victims too. You saw their morale crumbling, and you experienced the disintegration of their personalities, the growing of despair. things dripping through their fingers, you couldn't help but feel a certain pity. In 2002, Chechen terrorists seized over 800 hostages in a Moscow theater. Armed with bombs and guns, the terrorists held their hostages for 3 days until Russian special forces piped in fentanyl gas throughout the theater and then stormed the theater. Everyone was unconscious and many died from the fentanyl. Of the 130 hostages who died, only 5 had been killed by the terrorists. The rest died at the hands of the Russian special forces, largely as a consequence of the fentanyl inhalation. Upon debriefing, the Russian hostages reported initial disbelief, shock, and terror. Many thought that the Chechen terrorists were part of the evening's entertainment or a joke. But the Chechens promptly corrected that misimpression by savagely beating some of the hostages and murdering others. Unlike Stockholm's Jan Olsson and Clark Olofsson, the Chechens were prepared to die and murder every hostage. As the siege went on, the hostages lost their sense of time and reported emotional numbing because they were exhausted from lack of sleep. Despite the brutality of the Chechens, some hostages felt sorry for them. One reported, "When I came to gas, I felt very sorry that they were all killed." Some spoke of the Chechens' kindness to the children trapped in the theater. Others commented on the Chechens' manners and seriousness of purpose. Another remarked, "The Chechens were good to us. We should free Grozny, the capital of Chechnya." The Russians were flabbergasted at these sympathetic responses. One woman snapped at her liberated neighbor, "Have you become Chechens or what?" In 1976, 5 Croatian terrorists hijacked a TWA flight that was supposed to fly from New York to Chicago. The hijackers were courteous, but terrified the passengers and crew. As negotiations proceeded, the plane was diverted to Montreal. The hijackers released some of the passengers, but to show that they meant business, they informed authorities that they had left a bomb in Grand Central Station, and more bombs had been placed elsewhere. The police found the bomb in Grand Central. When they attempted to disarm it, one officer was killed and 2 others were seriously wounded. Meanwhile, the plane proceeded to Gander, Newfoundland, Keflavik, Iceland, and finally Paris, where the hijackers surrendered. Richard Brockman, a psychiatry resident who was a passenger on the plane, described his astonishment at the behavior of passengers and crew when the surrender was finalized. He writes, "We are all relieved. I see smiles, some tears. Some of the passengers thank the hijackers. For what? One of the passengers puts his arm around a hijacker saying, 'Have you and the others thought about going back to New York with us? You could get a fairer trial in America than from the French.' What is he saying? Do I hear right?" Brockman continued, reporting the surprising announcement from the plane's captain to the passengers. "This is the captain speaking. We have all been through an incredible experience, but it is over for us. However, it is not over for our hijackers. Their ordeal is just beginning. They are brave, committed people, like the people who helped to shape our country. They're trying to do the same for theirs. I think we should all give them a hand." Not all hostage situations involve politics, extremism, or kidnapping for profit. Some are carried out to satisfy the captor's fantasies for sex and domination. But even here, one sees some of Stockholm's attributes. In 1991, J.C. Dugard was kidnapped at age 11 by Philip Garrido, who had a prior conviction for kidnapping and rape. Garrido locked her up in a small shed, raped her repeatedly, and told her that she'd be killed by attack dogs if she left the shed. After 3 years of this, the restraints were lessened, but the assaults and victimization lasted for 18 years. Stunningly, Dugard avoided detection and rescue attempts despite repeated visits by Garrido's parole agent. When the agent eventually became suspicious of her presence in Garrido's house, J.C. did not ask for help, did not reveal her true identity, and claimed that her name was Alicia. The parole agent asked if she was aware that Garrido was a sex offender, and she replied that Garrido was a changed man and a great person who was good with her kids. She then said she didn't want to provide any more information. The agent persisted, asking for identification or the phone number of a relative or friend who could identify her. And Alicia replied that she carried no personal information and she wanted a lawyer. She then made up a story that she was from Minnesota and was hiding from an abusive husband. Meanwhile, her abductor, Garrido, was being questioned separately, and he admitted to kidnapping and raping Alicia. That's right, he confessed first. It took subsequent interviews before Alicia revealed that she was actually Dugard. Years later, when asked about her experiences living with Garrido, she replied that she was still mystified about the whole experience. I can't fathom how I kept it together. How did I even do that? She emphatically denied having any affection for Garrido and repudiated the situation that she had the Stockholm syndrome, saying instead that her behavior did not reflect affection for her abductor, but was a way to survive. She wrote, "Well, it's really degrading, having my family believe that I was in love with him, with his captor, and wanted to stay with him. I mean, that is so far from the truth that it makes me want to throw up. I adapted to survive my circumstances. There's just no other way to put it." In 2002, Elizabeth Smart was 14 years old when she was kidnapped and subjected to months of captivity and sexual assault. Her experience replicated some of Miss Dugard's themes. For 9 months, she wandered with her abductors and made no effort to escape. She'd been warned that if she ever tried to get away, her abductors would come after her, kill her, and then her entire family. When they were at last stopped by the police, she did as she was told and said that she was their daughter. She lied to the police about her birth date and said, "I know who you think I am. You think I'm that Elizabeth Smart girl that ran away, but I'm not." So there's a stigma associated with Stockholm syndrome, partly because of the lurid sadomasochistic fantasies that are emphasized in the newspapers, and partly because the behavior is so bizarre that people think the hostage had to be crazy. The hostage survivor, or I'm going to argue, or the survivor of rape, sexual trafficking, or abuse for that matter, is often confronted by cruel questions. Why didn't you run, scream, fight back? Did you develop unseemly bonds with your captors? Survivors rightfully bristle at the tactless insinuation of blame by the police, media, and acquaintances. Elizabeth Smart comments, nobody should ever question why you didn't do something. They have no idea what they would have done, and they certainly have no right to judge you. Everything I did to survive, and I did survive. Maybe there were times that had I done more, I would have been rescued, but maybe I wouldn't have. So do I regret anything I did? No. Well, I promised some data beyond case reports. What do we actually know about hostage and barricade situations, aka HABAs? The FBI has a HABAs database that I'll be relying on. So if you look at the large number of situations of hostage and barricade situations, the reality is that hostages are far more likely to be shot by the police than by the kidnappers. Indeed, 50% of hostages form a positive bond with their captors. It's difficult to assess what makes people more susceptible because most of this literature is based on small case series or reports, and they reflect highly specific idiosyncratic situations that may not generalize to all the variants of hostage scenarios. I'll highlight a few of them, including one dishearteningly large database. Italian investigators studied Sardinian kidnappings where people were held for ransom. They found that 50% of survivors reported some form of positive bond with their captors. Those who had been exposed to more humiliating experiences during their captivity and those who were held captive for a longer time were more likely to develop such feelings. Interesting, neither the victim's age nor presence of a prior psychiatric diagnosis were associated with vulnerability to such positive feelings for the captor. Another study, and this one is just an amazing study, using federal data on 447 hijackers and 20,000 hostages. Who knew? Who knew that it was such a large sample size? And the federal data looked at what situations foster positive feelings between the hijacker and the hostage. This sample size is dispiritingly large. In this large sample size, longer captivity experiences that featured extensive interactions with the hijacker seemed to foster the development of Stockholm-like feelings. Interestingly, the development of such feelings was not affected by the amount of the perpetrator's abuse of the victim. So, what do we do with this? How common is the Stockholm Syndrome? The fact is, there are wildly different estimates about how often the Stockholm Syndrome occurs. One FBI agent reported that full-blown Stockholm Syndrome occurs only in a very few people. On the other hand, in one hostage incident involving school children, 84 of the 87 hostages experienced negative feelings towards the law enforcement and positive feelings towards the hostage taker. So if the incidence of Stockholm syndrome ranges from rarely encountered to being found in over 95% of captives, it is impossible to characterize how often it occurs, other than to state it happens sometimes. The literature does suggest that it is more likely to develop in prolonged hostage or kidnapped situations. And there's a whiff of a suggestion that children and people who've led very sheltered lives and have little experience out of their home environment may be more vulnerable. So, Stockholm Syndrome takes place around the globe. Terrorism marks people, young and old, naive and educated, passers-by, prison guards, abused wives and children. Victims are grateful their experiences were not any worse than they were. They appreciate their captor because he could have killed me and he didn't. Sometimes this appreciation transforms into affection. One survivor stated, "I was alive because they let me live. You know, only a few people who hold your life in their hands and then give it back to you. After it was all over and we were safe and they were in handcuffs, I walked over to them and kissed each one of them and said, 'Thank you for giving me back my life.'" On the other hand, while the victim feels some appreciation of the perpetrator, many of the victims feel the world has abandoned them, and that in some way their interests and the captor's interests coincide. A survivor of the 1977 Hanafi terrorism in Washington described it well. "Terrorists are like pirates. They hold their prisoners for ransom while they barter with the world and the world's conscience. Isolated from the world, you wonder if the world cares." The hostage thus decides to get along with the abductor and make the best of a bad situation. I use the word decides, the hostage decides, reservedly because there isn't a word that captures the complex intermingling between conscious intention and unconscious action. Under continuing exposure to life-threatening stress, some people, paradoxically, develop more trust and affection for their captors than their rescuers. This constitutes the essence of the Stockholm Syndrome. I'm going to conclude by discussing some of the explanations that have been offered for the Stockholm Syndrome. Traditional psychiatric explanations reflecting older theoretical frameworks, like identification with the aggressor, are typically rejected by survivors. Identification with the aggressor was described by Sandor Ferenczi and Anna Freud in the 1930s in their studies of abused children. They viewed it as an unconscious defense mechanism against powerlessness, whereby the victimized child starts to empathize and feel gratitude to the aggressor. In the traumatic situation, the victim dissociates, and by identifying with the aggressor, the victim feels stronger and less vulnerable. On the other hand, when framed from the perspective of life stress and coping, the Stockholm Syndrome is more readily understandable and is viewed less as a mark of psychopathology and more as an instance of coping under extraordinary stress. Getting close to the abductor is life-saving. The hostage focuses attention on the captor's occasional kindnesses rather than their brutality. This can be life-saving because a positive bond affects both captive and captor. Surrounded and threatened by assault from the police, both captor and captive recognize their joint vulnerability. Captives want to survive, but are totally dependent upon their captors. The power differential between the two is enormous, and to survive, the hostage must do all in his power to turn aside the lethal anger of his captor. I mentioned a couple minutes ago, one FBI analysis of the prevalence of Stockholm syndrome, but there's another which is quite interesting. FBI agent Thomas Strentz developed and directed the FBI hostage crisis negotiation program for 10 years. He describes the situation in terms of child development and regression. It's a stunning quote to hear out of the mouth of an FBI agent. The 5-year-old is able to feed himself, speak for himself, and has locomotion. The hostage, on the other hand, is more like the infant who must cry for food, cannot speak, and may be bound. The hostage is in a state of extreme dependence and fright. He is terrified of the outside world. So, what do you think? Have you encountered anything akin to this in your personal or professional experience, or in your friends or acquaintances? Does the Stockholm syndrome exist, and how do we understand it?